Hey everyone, welcome to the Psyched Practice Podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insight from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm your host, Ray Christner, and with me,
Paul Wagner.
And today we are bringing you a Masters in Practice episode with a local Pennsylvania psychologist who has kind of a national presence, Dr. Ari Tuckman.
Yeah. And, for listeners, if that name sounds familiar, I think I have referenced him probably in like 3 or 4 different episodes. When I was kind of going through some different trainings, he was the person giving the presentation. And so it was a really cool experience to be, have this kind of face to face, even if it was virtually, and really going in depth. A lot of times his primary focus in trainings is ADHD, but we got to kind of go through his entire focus, which is ADHD, but also couples relationship and sex therapy. And I think we probably could have spent an entire episode on each individual area, but it was a cool experience hearing how all 3 blend together. And I think he does a really great job of giving the information of why he pursues this and how they can blend together.
Yeah, it really is it's, I think, a really good conversation. And I think we could have probably taken each of those areas and talked about them for an hour each. But he's such an intelligent guy and comes across in just such this natural way of conversation that time just flew for me, and it was great having him on.
Yeah. Well, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Dr. Ari Tuckman, he's a psychologist and sex therapist in a private practice in Westchester, PA, specializing in diagnosing and treating people with ADHD, as well as working with couples and sex therapy. He's a former board member and a current conference committee co-chair for CHAD and the National ADHD Advocacy Organization. He's also written a number of books, and as I alluded to, he's frequently a presenter both at conferences and does a lot of trainings as well. So he has a lot of experience in the field.
He does, and definitely would encourage people to check out his presentations. They're engaging, and I feel like every time I see him, learn something new. So I guess, Paul, what's something new you learned today? What's a takeaway for you out of this?
So a lot of the conversation, it was a new take on kind of common ideas that I know, which, in a way he references as, ADHD in a nutshell is. But one thing that he really kind of specifically called out was in the couple's dynamic, it's not uncommon, especially if, before they're engaging in treatment, for one of the individuals in the relationship to be more of the parent role, and then the individual with ADHD being more the child role. And he kind of described it as this, we're working for. And one of the goals of, his treatment model is transitioning to a working with. And I love that. It's simple and it's eloquent, but it really does. And he does a great job of talking about why we get into that pattern, but also talking about some ways that we can break that pattern and create a more connective relationship. And so I really appreciated that. How about you, Ray?
Yeah, it's funny because I think one thing about Ari that's brilliant is there's so many little quotes that he gives that are like these takeaways that I'm just keeping in my pocket and can't wait to use. And so that was one I had down to moving to working with rather than working for. And I was like, what a simple little sentence that just really puts things together. And, so for me, again, something not necessarily new, but when we were talking about kind of the impairments or the functional impairments, he made this comment that ADHD exacerbates the universal problems or impairments that we all have. And something, again, I think we know, but to just sit down and go, okay, like we're not talking about new or different problems with couples that have ADHD. It's that they have the same problems, but they're just exacerbated to a level that they stand out more. There are days that I forget to do something that my wife tells me that's not related to ADHD. But with ADHD, maybe that happens more frequently or more intensely. And I think just bringing that down to that simple idea of that we're really looking at treating the exacerbation of it or intervening with the exacerbation of it. I think, again, just a simple little thing that it was like, oh, wow, what something easy to keep in my mind. So I loved his little gems. I have a whole tablet full now. So, yes. We brought up 2, but I hope listeners out there, you pull out a whole bunch of little gems from this episode as well. And if you do, as always, please share them with us. Join us on social media, email us, contact us. We're always interested in your insights.
And with that, we hope you enjoy this Masters in Practice episode, Sex, Drugs, and ADHD with Dr. Ari Tuckman.
So Ari, thanks so much for joining us on the Psyched to Practice podcast. Paul and I are excited to have you with us today.
Well, I'm always happy to talk about this, and I'm especially always happy to talk about it when I'm not preaching to the choir, if you know what I mean. Like all the folks who specialize in ADHD, I mean, they're great people. I love them, but they kind of don't need to hear what I have to say. I like talking to more general audiences and hopefully getting a few new ideas out there.
Well, we appreciate that.
Absolutely.
So we're going to kind of start today. We like our audience to have a little idea of people who are joining us on the show and a little bit about your background. So before we kind of get into the content, tell us a little bit about what got you or led you into the field of mental health or being a psychologist.
Sure. So it's kind of it was an easy thing. So my dad was a psychologist, his younger brother was a psychologist, and his older brother was a psychiatrist. And the younger brother's second wife was a psychologist. So it was a little bit hard to escape, although my brother's doing something else. But it's just, I don't know, like it's just really great work. Like I feel really lucky that this is a thing I can do and get paid for it. It's interesting. It's meaningful. I feel like I make a difference. I've certainly invested in getting good at what I do, presuming I am good at what I do. So, that makes it a lot more fun and rewarding because it kind of sucks to feel like you're floundering, although we all have those moments. So yeah, it's been a good gig, I got to say.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're the first person we've talked to that has that kind of family history in psychology that led you here. That's pretty cool. So you kind of grew up with it.
I did, and it just sort of, I don't know, like my dad was in private practice and then he also worked in community mental health. So, I mean, not that he would obviously sort of reveal confidential information, but, sometimes he would talk about the work that he did or what was interesting or meaningful or challenging. And it just really sort of struck me as something interesting and kind of important work. So, besides sitting in my office and seeing people all day, I do a lot of writing. I do a lot of presenting. And I feel like that sort of three-legged stool, so to speak, it's like, I think each of them makes you better at the others. So, and that they very much reinforce. And I think they give me a sense of variety as well. So I'm not just doing one thing all the time.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious. I know one of your specialties is ADHD and kind of how I got to, I think, know your work started specifically with the ADHD work that you've done. But then intermixed with that, there's couples work and sex therapy and this integration of the three. How did you get into the work with ADHD couples and sex therapy?
Yeah. So, when I came out of school in the late 90s, I sort of stumbled on adult ADHD as an area of specialty, which was really an underserved population at the time. It's gotten better, but, for a long time, ADHD was all about the kids and not about the adults, as if like they disappeared at 18 or something. So, that was a really great area to practice. It's still a great area to practice. But the more I sort of thought about it, I was like, you know what? People with ADHD don't exist in a vacuum, right? None of us do. Most of us have relationships, and ADHD affects that part too. So I became more interested in couples therapy and more interested in sex therapy because, obviously that's kind of an important part of relationships too. So I could work more sort of systemically to help not just the person with ADHD, but also their partner. Because when they're not, when a couple's not doing well at home, everything in life is harder.
Yeah, that's a really unique kind of view. I think your work's the first that I've really saw that combination. So are there individuals that is, I guess when you're working with people, is it that they come to you first with ADHD and then the couples and sex therapy are kind of add-ons? Or are there people directly coming in related to the stress of their relationship in regards to their ADHD?
Yeah. So it sort of happened both ways. Initially it was people are seeing individually, then, more and more relationship things are being brought up. So that's how I sort of slid into the couples therapy and the sex therapy. But at this point, I've sort of done enough sort of writing and presenting on ADHD and couples that have people reaching out to me specifically for that. And there's this sort of thing where, like, in the Venn diagram of clinicians who work with adults with ADHD and, couples therapists, there's like hardly any overlap. It's sort of, there are two worlds and ne'er the twain shall meet, if you know what I mean. So part of my mission, which is why I'm glad for this opportunity, is I try to get the folks in the world of ADHD to get training to do couples therapy. And I try to get couples therapists to get training to understand adults with ADHD. Because, by the way, they are in your caseload, guaranteed, and at more than the 4% general population prevalence. Like, they are there. It's just a question of whether you know it, they know it, and whether you're working on it most effectively.
Yeah, well, I love that idea of, they are there. We need to be aware of them and we need to be really recognizing it. And when you're working with either an individual or a couple, and maybe we're not talking specifically about ADHD, or maybe it hasn't really been identified initially, like, what's the contrast there, do you think? Like, how does couples treatment change when we're identifying that ADHD is involved with at least one partner, if not potentially both partners?
So, what changes is that, so there's a famous saying by Russell Barkley, who's sort of like the god of ADHD. And he has this line where he says, ADHD is not a disorder of knowing what to do. It's a disorder of doing what you know. Now, my add-on to that brilliant nugget is, in fact, people with ADHD know far better what to do because they've been told far more often what to do, right? So if you're a kid with ADHD, do your homework, duh, right? Like, don't leave your English paper on the printer. Don't impulsively hit your brother. Don't leave your room a mess. Mom freaks out about that, right? So, that's when you're a kid. Then you become an adult who's had, a million comments, criticisms, and corrections. And now it's your spouse who's doing it, right? Text your spouse that you're going to be late. That's not a hard concept. Don't leave stuff out in the kitchen because it makes them crazy. Don't interrupt them when they're talking. Don't forget to do the stuff they ask you to do. These are not hard concepts, but the challenge is actually doing it, at least like most of the time. And this is where folks with ADHD sort of really struggle, which then creates a situation where for their spouse, they feel like it doesn't matter what I say or do. I don't get what I want from you. Person with ADHD feels like it doesn't matter what I, do anyway. It never seems to work out. The spouse with ADHD or the non-ADHD spouse might then respond possibly by kind of withdrawing and giving up. But usually I don't think they show up as often in therapy, more like they start kind of cranking down the control, right? Like, if not for me getting on your case about it, nothing around here is going to happen, which then creates this kind of parent-child dynamic, which is not sexy for anybody. And it can then set up a dynamic in the couples therapy where if you're not looking at ADHD, you sort of see the partner with ADHD as maybe selfish, just sort of irresponsible. They're kind of a slacker. Not only do they forget to do what their spouse asks them to do, by the way, they're probably not doing your homework either. So when you say, here's a worksheet, fill this out and come back next session, the non-ADHD spouse has it all perfectly printed and, like extra pages attached to the back and all. And the partner with ADHD is pulling out some like crumpled piece of paper if they have it at all, So it's easy then to say, aha, you're the problem here. Got it. And then apply a bunch of strategies that are certainly well-intentioned, but probably don't work or don't stick as well as you would hope or as anyone would hope. So the couples therapist then can feel as sort of disempowered and frustrated as both of the partners do.
And in drawing awareness to that, I hear how it keeps us from making almost a values-based judgment on the individual with ADHD. And it's not that they don't care. It's not that they're not willing. It's not that, that the relationship is unimportant. It just redefines what it is that we're looking at. And we're kind of getting away from this more personalized judgment of like what's valuable to them or what's important to them. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah. Because all of us as a person in a relationship, right? We all have to figure that out. And by the way, there's nobody who's going to really challenge you to figure that out, like in a nuanced, subtle way, more than your, romantic partner will, right? Like, what are your values? What's really, really important? And therefore, what's less important? Because if you're going to live with somebody else, you don't get everything you want, but hopefully you get in total more good stuff than if you live by yourself, right? So every single couple has to navigate that and navigate, negotiating the differences and all of that. When there's some untreated and probably undiagnosed ADHD in the mix, it just sort of muddies those waters. It just makes it that much harder to figure out. And I've got this line that ADHD doesn't invent new problems. It just exacerbates the universal ones, right? These couples have exactly the same struggles as everybody else, just more. Which also means when you get good at working with these couples, you're probably better at working with every other couple too.
And well, I'll tell you, Ari, some of your lines probably aren't new for our listeners. I'm actually familiar with your work through the PESI trainings that you
nice.
offered. And so that's one of the lines. I can't remember if it's been shared in here, but certainly I know it's been shared in my therapy office there before. And it's absolutely right. Like I hear how it's not anything groundbreaking or it's not anything so abstract. And I think that's in some ways how it can be missed in a way, like that idea of an undiagnosed ADHD coming into the couple's relationship therapy process. And it's like, hey, there's another dynamic here that we're not really recognizing because it kind of is flying under the radar. But if we attune our radar, we can really, it lights up pretty brightly.
Absolutely. And, in that sense, it's not unique. And, so like, I don't know, if a partner has, sort of an active substance abuse that's not being addressed, that's going to have an effect. If someone has, significant anxiety or depression, or I don't know, they've got like major insomnia that is making them grumpy and irritable and, all of whatever is going on that's not being addressed. Or I don't know, they have like sick parents and young kids and they're caught between, right? Like that's going to affect the relationship too. So I think, we need to look at sometimes beyond just what the obvious stuff that's being brought up in session and figure out what else is going on here that's impacting this couple's ability to sort of navigate the demands of the day.
And how do you find the response is like when we are noting it as, ADHD in the relationship? Like, how does the partner respond? How does the individual respond? When we're kind of putting a name to this pervasive pattern that's there.
Yeah. As you would expect, it sort of runs the gamut. There are certainly some people who are sort of defensive or they're like, nah, that, not me. Now that might be because their understanding of what ADHD looks like doesn't match their experience, right? And that's just they just understand it differently and then you educate them a little bit. For some people, it's harder because it feels like there it is, official proof that I'm screwed up or I'm the problem here, so like I understand why that wouldn't feel so good. But for a lot of folks, I don't know. I mean, I get a self-selected audience, but for a lot of them, there's really this sense of relief. It's this sort of feeling of like, that finally makes sense. No one, okay, yeah. Okay, now I get it. For both partners. And, that can be a really powerful moment. It's sort of, I don't know, my joke about this is it's like, the last chapter of the mystery novel when it all comes together and you're like, oh, that's why the maid's hands were wet, So the optimism, so on the one hand, it explains the past in a very different way, right? It's not that you're selfish and don't care. It's that you forget everything in your life. And 40 years ago, before you met me, you were also forgetting everything in your life. So it's not about me and how much I deserve to be loved. And it's not about your ability to love. Like, this is a neurological thing. But it also offers a real sort of hope for the future, that all the same stuff we've been doing that didn't get us anywhere, that's fine. There's this other thing we can do. And then maybe those other old things will actually get us somewhere. So, that's the sort of promise of it. Now, equally, there's also, and this may not be in the moment, this may come a bit later, but sort of a sense of mourning or a sense of anger over the past that wasn't, that thing of like, God, damn it, man. If someone had said this before, I would have had so much less heartache. And they're right. Now how realistic that is, I don't know. I mean, if they saw someone 5 years ago, yeah, they probably legit, someone should have seen it. If they're 60 years old and we're talking about their childhood, that wasn't going to happen. 50 years ago, they were not. ADHD was hardly being diagnosed. Or if you're a girl and you're inattentive, definitely not. So, you can be mad at the universe, but you can't be mad at individuals. But that's a part of it, right? It's mourning the past that wasn't, and possibly, mourning the future that won't be.
Yeah. Ari, you had mentioned something earlier about this kind of parent-child dynamic that happens. And, one of the things I see is oftentimes I'll have adults come in for an evaluation, mostly because their kids were diagnosed and they go, oh, it must be me.
Yeah,
right? I think they got it from me. And when we're going through the results, that's something that comes out pretty dominantly, where it's like, wow, okay, their spouse has taken on this parent role. And I always find it hard to figure how to help break that parent-child dynamic or how to shift that. How do you address that with couples?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, it's helpful for them to understand why it makes sense that they got there. And, on the one hand, there's this, so Ned Hallowell coined this saying where he said, those with attention deficit tend to marry those with attention excess. Organized, timely, on top of things. Now, of course, there's also the question, did they start out that way or did they become that way? And probably the answer is yes, both. But, the challenge for folks with ADHD is that they tend to activate later, right? So something needs to be done. The non-ADHD partner starts to feel that anxiety earlier, or just remembers like, oh yeah, we got to do that thing. So it's more on their mental radar, and then they start doing something about it, or they tell their partner, hey, remember, you got to, set up an appointment to get the car inspected. And their partner says, oh yeah, okay, cool. And then they forget. And then 2 days later, they're like, hey, did you ever set that up? Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. Tomorrow morning, I will give them a call. And then they forget. And then after a while, the partner is like, it's less work for me to just call. I'm asking you 3 times and it doesn't happen. And then I call anyway. Clearly, the path of least resistance is I will just call, which is fine for one thing, but it's not fine when it becomes 70% of the things. So and then they get sort of stuck in that. And then the non-ADHD partner, sort of understandably is kind of tired and resentful. But then the partner with ADHD too often feels like, even when I do it, it's not the right thing, or it's not the right way, or timing, or like, why am I killing myself on this? Or they do kill themselves for like a week and then they sort of fall back to baseline. So kind of understanding why that totally makes sense as a way to resolve it. And that if you don't know about ADHD and you can't more effectively manage it, parent-child is sort of your better option, frankly, as opposed to like just chaos and things not getting done. However, now with this diagnosis, now if we sort of treat it a little bit more effectively, now we've got the more desired third option, which is that the partner with ADHD becomes more effective and is better able to step up and do what they're supposed to do. Or as I call it, working with rather than working for, right? Mm-hmm. Equals work with each other. So partner with ADHD steps up, takes some things off the non-ADHD partner's plate. Non-ADHD partner steps back. That also has to happen. Also has to get clear on what is really important and they want it done their way. What are the things they're willing to flex on and let go? Also means unintended consequence. Partner with ADHD also, as an equal, has the ability to say, I don't really want to do that thing. Turns out I'm not really actually interested in doing that. So I'm going to say thanks, but no thanks. And I'm going to give that one back to you. Right. But that's completely different than, yeah, honey, I'll do it. Oh, crap, I forgot. Mm-hmm. Yeah, honey. Yeah, honey. Yeah, honey. Right. Oh, wait, you did it? Right. So like, it's a much more sort of honest and direct and sort of active handling of responsibilities, as opposed to this sort of tasks falling into the ether kind of a thing.
I like that idea of really kind of acknowledging the fact that the parent-child dynamic, it just is what was functional for them. Like, I mean, I think like I love that idea of just, because I think so often people feel guilty because they've been in that both partners, one because they've needed somebody to be a parent for them, and one that, they're trying to parent their spouse. I think it's hard for both parts. I think I love the fact of just saying that to them and saying, hey, listen, this is what worked and this is what needed to happen to get you to this point. Now we move forward. I think it just kind of settles I'm going to use the word guilt. I don't know if that's really the word I want, but the guilt of having that relationship, and just saying like, hey, it's what you did to survive. It's a great approach. I appreciate that.
And I think that normalizing is incredibly important and powerful, and not just in terms of the relationship, but also other stuff in terms of, I don't know, like, why was school so difficult? And yet, like, you're this smart guy. Why did you struggle so much? Or, financial decisions that they made, or, I don't know, always struggling to get places on time, or, like all of that. And, for women, or for girls and women, it can be even worse because, girls and women are socialized generally to kind of be more accommodating, right? To be more polite, to look like they got it together. Boys kind of have a bit more implicit permission to say, this is stupid, I'm not going to do it. So a friend of mine, Linda Rogley, who is an ADHD coach, and I think the first line of her book is something like, I've decided to stop, or I no longer apologize to doorknobs when I bump into them, right? Because like apologizing is her first go-to response, right? There's something happened, it's probably my fault, right? So kind of seeing all of this through a different lens is incredibly powerful. And frankly, that's half of what we do in therapy anyway, right? We don't change people's past. We just change how they understand it so that, fingers crossed, they got better options going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think that's so helpful just to kind of get that, that kind of approach with people. So I appreciate that.
And I guess along those lines, Ari, like as we're talking about the increasing the working with rather than the working for, I'm wondering, like, what does an individual with successfully managed ADHD, for themselves, but also integrating that into the relationship and into their sex life, what does that look like? How do you feel like, okay, hey, we're at a good point. Like it's managed, and certainly, as transitions and life changes come on, that might change. But in this present moment, we're functioning pretty well, and we've reached that balance of working with. What are some of those markers that you look for?
I think it's about feeling like they can sort of resolve differences, effectively, because differences will continue to show up. I think it's that they're able to sort of manage the demands on their life, and in a way that, neither one of them feels overburdened, and they're better able to kind of work through stuff. So, but it also creates the situation then where there are differences that are not actually about ADHD, so like, I had a couple I was seeing last week. Guy has ADHD. So it's his job to clean up the kitchen at night. The wife really likes to come down to a clean kitchen in the morning. Fine. That's a fair request. So he cleaned up the kitchen, and there was like a piece of Tupperware that was wet. So he left it out on the counter. I think there was like one other thing. So there were literally two things he left out. And for her, this was really upsetting because she didn't come down to a perfectly clean kitchen. So like in this case, was this an ADHD thing? Not really. Like it was wet. He made an affirmative decision to leave it out. That's not ADHD. Now, if he forgot to clean the kitchen, that's ADHD. If he procrastinated and then fell asleep on the couch, that's ADHD. If he mismanaged his time and ran out of time to do it, that's ADHD, right? So, but in this case, it wasn't ADHD, right? That wasn't like, I'm sure there's other things he did that pissed her off, right? That were more related, but like that wasn't one. So, it's like, it's this thing that knowing what's ADHD kind of benefits you both ways, right? The one is to say, oh, this seems like an ADHD thing. Let's use better strategies. Also to say, that doesn't sound like ADHD. Let's look elsewhere.
And one of the other pieces you had mentioned earlier of like when it turns into the parent-child role, it's very unsexy.
Yeah.
And, we've been talking a lot about the impact that ADHD has on the relationship, but I'm wondering a bit more specifically, like what does maybe unmanaged or undiagnosed ADHD, how does that impact sex life for a couple?
Sure. So, as probably nobody will be surprised to hear, when I wrote my book, ADHD After Dark in 2019, I wanted to look at how it affected a couple's relationship, but also their sex life, right? So the surprising to no one thing is there was no research out there on how ADHD impacts a couple's sex life. So nor was anyone speaking about it, by which I mean the people who stand at the front of a room with an audience, right? The couples, they were talking about it all the time at home, right? But none of the presenters and writers and whatever were talking about it. So, so before I wrote the book, I put together this big online survey, and for couples with one ADHD partner, so one with, one without, and got a whole bunch of people to fill it out and did a bunch of analysis. And, in general, folks with ADHD, group averages, tend to have greater what I called sexual eagerness, meaning in the 12 questions that had anything to do with kind of sexual eagerness. So things like, desired sexual frequency, masturbation frequency, porn use frequency, how quickly do you get turned on, kind of things like that. On 12 questions, the folks with ADHD rated themselves higher on 10 and tied the other two, right? And in this case, I took gender out. So men with ADHD versus men without, women with ADHD versus women without. And on the one hand, that's just like an interesting finding, but it totally makes sense. Like it's absolutely consistent with our understanding of ADHD, which is folks with ADHD tend to be more attuned to the interesting things in their environment, whether it's in the world around them or inside their head. And let's face it, the important, responsible things in life are usually boring. They're kind of annoying, and they're more about benefiting the future. right? You don't eat kale now because it's delicious. You eat kale because it's good for you later, right? You don't floss your teeth because it's fun. You don't study for calculus because you're loving it. I mean, some people do, so awesome for them. But like, you don't save receipts for taxes in, June because that's fun. You save them in June because you're going to need them in hopefully March, not April 14th, but like whatever. So, important, responsible things are usually about delaying gratification. And that's where folks with ADHD have a harder time. They're more pulled by and have a harder time resisting the temptations of the moment. So they tend to then make decisions that tend to benefit the present at the cost of the future. So long answer around, sex is pretty interesting, right? Like that's kind of fun. And let's face it, probably more fun than vacuuming, probably more fun than working on that report for work or whatever. So the positive of this is having someone who has more of that kind of like interest in sex is important in long-term relationships because, in the long term, sex has a tendency to sort of slide away. And the couple misses out on that positive, rejuvenating, reconnecting energy. So somebody's got to keep sex front and center. So when it works well, it's awesome. The problem is if the couple is really struggling and at least one of them doesn't want to have sex with the other, then it becomes yet another sort of disappointment and discontent. So like that is a double-edged sword that cuts big both ways.
When we're talking about helping an individual or helping the couple really manage the ADHD, like what are the interventions or what are the strategies that you're talking about that, not the Tupperware left out because it needs to dry, but because we're falling asleep and, or the poor time management, like what are the interventions that you feel are, most broadly effective for individuals in rebalancing the workload or rebalancing the expectations? And it is a bit more of that partnership.
Sure. So, the intervention that is going to have the biggest and the most immediate impact when it comes to ADHD is stimulant medication. It's not magic. It doesn't do the work for you, but I kind of say that, kind of riffing off Barkley, that, what it does is it helps people with ADHD do what they know, so in all those 100 little ways through the day, it just helps them do what they know. So, the stimulants that we use for kids are exactly the stimulants that we use for adults. All of this stuff is like ancient history, right? So Ritalin's been around since like World War II or something. Adderall's been around since the 80s. Vyvanse, which is the other big one, is just an extended release version of Dexedrine. And that's been around since, I don't know, like the 70s or something. So these are really well understood. Generally speaking, they're very effective in terms of what they're supposed to do. The risks and side effects are totally manageable. And they're not super hard to get right. I mean, it takes a little bit of knowledge on the sake of the prescriber, but they're not super complicated. And, just to sort of address like the big elephant in the room, there's a concern like, oh, stimulants are addictive. But like, here's my smart ass response. Adults with ADHD are far more likely to forget their prescription than they are to take too much of it, right? So they forget to take their pill. Trust me, ask their spouses, you'll hear. They forget to take their pill. They don't call the doctor for a refill. They don't get to the pharmacy when there is actually a refill waiting, right? People who are addicted to heroin don't forget to take their heroin. Like it just doesn't happen. So by definition, if you forget it, you are not addicted to it. And in fact, people who struggle with substance abuse and have ADHD are less likely to break their sobriety when they're taking a stimulant medication. So, like that's a whole nother soapbox that I won't get onto. But what it does is, like I said, it kind of helps people with ADHD do what they know. So I think on the one hand, I think it's a lot to ask your partner to take medication, right? That's a pretty big request, On the other hand, I think equally, it's a big request to ask your partner to tolerate the impact of your ADHD when you're not addressing it. Right. So like here is one of those difficult discussions for couples like we all have to have.
And I can think like when I'm having this conversation, probably about like 70% of the time, if it's something where we're just kind of starting to identify ADHD, there's an openness and a willingness and, just trying to provide that psychoeducation aspect of it. But there's then like maybe that 20 to 30% where there's a really strong stance that says, no, I don't want the medication. I don't want to be, I don't want it to be something that I'm taking for the rest of my life or I'm taking every day. I just want the strategies. Yeah. And I try to talk to them about like, hey, like, we could talk about that. We can work on that. And we do the best that we can. And it's not my role as a therapist to make them take medication or to make them do those things. Just giving them the information to make those informed decisions for themselves. So I know the strategies that I typically will pull on, but I'm wondering, outside of the medication, what are some of those other strategies that you encourage, especially for adults in relationships who are maybe struggling in that couples relationship or struggling with, there being a disconnect between, in their sex life? Sure. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Your job as a therapist is to inform your client's decision. Then they decide. We get 0 votes. So sometimes you got to play a bit of the long game where it's like, look, if you don't want to take meds, that's fine. And then we keep talking about how they keep having the same problems and how they're unhappy about how things are working out. And then you're like, well, this is sort of what happens if you're not taking medication. So, I think, one of the things I often recommend to couples, especially busy couples, and they've got like a couple of kids who are going like 6 directions, like somebody has soccer and somebody has scouts and there's also this and there's also that. And, is to do a weekly meeting, right? Where you just sit down, calendar and to-do list in hand, and let's actually run through like, what is the deal for the coming week? So there's less of that thing of like Tuesday morning, wait a second, you're taking the kids to the dentist appointment. What? I can't do. I've got a meeting. I can't do that. Yes, you can. We talked about this 3 weeks ago, right? Those crises of the moment you want to minimize. So let's actually show up to the meeting. You don't just show up, but you actually are prepared, meaning you know what your schedule looks like. Or you know what, if you're the one getting the emails about scouts, you're the one responsible for it, which means putting it on the calendar or asking your partner to do it or whatever. And then running through what's happening, making sure ideally, if you have some sort of shared calendar system, that's even better. But making sure everything's on everybody's schedule, making sure it's clear who's doing what. But part of that also is that having the ability to say, you know what, I really don't want to do that. Like Wednesday night, there's too much going on. We're not taking our kids to scouts. Like we're skipping scouts on Wednesday. But that is a way better conversation on Sunday than it is on Wednesday at 3, and let's really hash out what's happening. Now, there's always new stuff that comes up. So maybe they need to talk more often, but at least it's one of the ways that there's less that falls through the cracks and just creates kind of stress and aggravation. I think the value of having that externalized list or, where we're taking it, offloading that executive functioning and putting it someplace that doesn't require us to be attentive. And, so we're getting the calendar, the notifications, the to-do list that we can reference, all of those pieces. And I'm curious of your thoughts. This is one thing that a previous guest of ours kind of brought up, and I've tried to integrate it a lot in terms of the conversations I have with adults or even with parents with ADHD. And this idea of automaticity. And it's if we can create an automatic response rather than kind of the need for a cognitive one. And whether it's one that we're able to just kind of go on autopilot for, or one that we're creating almost an ingrained reactive response that says, if this, then this is happening. And I don't even need to think about it. I'm just doing it. And as best we can through repetition and through a deeper understanding of the process. But a lot of it is more just that building in the pattern and the repetition. What are your thoughts on that? Absolutely. I mean, definitely the less intentional thought, the better, right? Because you only got a certain amount of intentional thought in you in a day. So, so the sort of like the simple example of this is, where do you put your keys when you walk in the door?
right? Now that for a lot of people is kind of like, who cares, whatever. And if you say whatever, it's because you don't struggle with it. But if you're someone whose keys could wind up, frankly, anywhere, and then you can't find them and you're showing up to work late, your boss will not think whatever, So something like having a place that you put them, and it's one of those things that sometimes small differences make a big difference, right? In the sense that if you got to take 4 steps to the right when you come in the door to see the bowl and put them there, you're less likely to do it compared to if you have to take 1 step or preferably 0 steps, right? So a lot of it is about, it's those nuances of how to sort of set people up for success. A lot of it is about kind of eliminating distractions before you get distracted. So I had a couple in my office yesterday where the wife thought the guy had ADHD. He wasn't so sure, but he has an office where he works. He kind of runs an office and he'll close the door, which is good, but then people still knock on the door, which I think they don't understand concept of door. But so then he'll work from home, which is great, except then his kids are there. So that's distracting. So then he got a 3rd office that's just him, right? Now, obviously, this is not a solution for everybody, but it's a good example of if he can't manage his distractibility inside his head, what he can manage is the environment around him. So a lot of managing ADHD is about, I kind of think of it as signal to noise ratio. So the stuff that you're supposed to pay attention to, make that big, front and center and loud. The stuff that you shouldn't be paying attention to, make that smaller, quieter, and off to the side. And then, it's stuff like setting reminders, living out of your schedule and not just sort of winging it out of your head, being really diligent about the systems that you use and to stick to them. So there's a lot of strategies that go into that.
And it's amazing the difference going back to that idea of the value of a stimulant medication. I'm wondering, when you're talking with couples that maybe there's some hesitation to try it, and we're talking about some of these strategies, and there's an earnest effort put forth, but the follow through is, it's inconsistent.
Sure.
There's just that inconsistency there that I feel like one of the trademarks of ADHD is inconsistency.
Indeed. Absolutely.
And so as we're talking then, and they're like, okay, let me give this medication a try. And, the value of stimulant medication is that it's not, we don't have to take it for a long time to then see the effects of it. What's the response that you typically see for individuals? Maybe even if there's any general audience members that maybe I'm not super sure. I can speak from my experience, but, having the specialty when someone is finally open and willing to try stimulant medication, and obviously gets on the dosage that's appropriate for them.
Yeah.
What's the difference that you see there?
So first thing is, what I tell people is, if you can't tell whether or not it's working, it's not working. Right? If you're not so sure, if you have to pause and reflect upon it, if your spouse sees no difference at all, assuming you're there during the day when it's active, or if you don't know when it wears off, it's because it's not doing anything when it's working. You can't tell the difference when it's gone. So it should be clear and obvious that it's doing something. And what it does is it quiets some of the mental chatter, so to speak. It makes it easier to focus on one thing and ignore other things. It makes it easier to sort of hold stuff in mind, right? And not have it sort of bumped out by the next, passing thought. It makes it easier to kind of activate earlier, so less procrastination. It gives you another moment of pause before kind of impulsively acting or speaking. So that's what it does. So, some of this is obviously internal experience, one can tell they're less distracted, but, there's also a lot of this that's kind of externally visible, or there are sort of external markers. So, for example, I had a couple of weeks ago where the woman was being evaluated. And one of the things I said was there'll be less glasses, left on the kitchen island. The husband laughed, right? So he's not there to see her leaving them, right? So he can't witness it, but he can witness the artifacts of her, attention or lack thereof. So it should be obvious. And frankly, I want the partner's input, right? Like, what are you seeing from it? And, particularly because the stimulants tend to be short acting. So even with the extended release versions, hopefully they're lasting 10 to 12 hours. But if they're a little bit short, or depending how long your day and work day and commute are, your partner may not be there to see it. Now, your boss and coworkers get all the benefit. And maybe you get out of work earlier, so your partner gets you earlier in the evening. But, sometimes that's part of the discussion too, right? It's doing well during the day, but maybe a little bit of a short acting booster at the end of the day to kind of carry that out, so your spouse and kids get a bit of benefit too. And frankly, you get the benefit yourself in the evening.
And Ari, I'm going to kind of jump back, and you kind of said something earlier that's kind of been in my mind, and this is probably a much bigger box than we want to open with a few minutes left in recording. But you made a comment about individuals that have addiction and medication, and I hear that a lot about from prescribing physicians saying, well, you have an addiction history, so we can't give you stimulant medication. And my experience is more in line with what I think we're alluding to, where I actually find that it helps them stay sober, if they get the right medication, there's a longer benefit. How do you approach that when you run into the barrier of physicians saying, nope, we won't prescribe a stimulant because we'll let you try Wellbutrin, but we won't let you do a stimulant medication because we're afraid of relapse. What's your approach as a clinician with that?
I mean, this is one of those things that makes me want to break stuff, right? Because, and it's not just the physicians, it's also the treatment programs. It's also the judges, if there's like legal involvement. And I mean, they mean well, they're just wrong, right? They don't know what the science says. So, there's a huge overlap between ADHD and substance abuse problems. It is a big risk factor. And actually there was some studies done long ago, but that kids with ADHD put on stimulants are actually less likely to have substance abuse problems as young adults. So, ADHD is a disorder of self-regulation. What are the 10 steps say? I am powerless over this, right? Like that kind of sounds like the same thing to me. So I think if you deprive people with ADHD of the most effective medication, you are setting them up to fail. And I mean, there are non-stimulants like Wellbutrin, Strattera, and Intuniv and Capve, but they're at best half as effective. Like they are not by any means an equal substitute. So, if the person has, if they have an addiction to cocaine, you might be concerned about a stimulant, but even then, more so if they have a history of crushing up Adderall and snorting it. But, that's very much the smallest subset of the folks with substance abuse problems. If someone drinks too much, if they smoke too much pot, like they're not going to abuse their stimulant. And frankly, most people with ADHD, if you exceed their optimal dose, they're going to ask you to lower it because they don't feel better. They feel worse. So, maybe it's a thing where, their partner holds the medication if that makes them feel, the prescriber feel a bit better about it. Or, Vyvanse, for example, whether you swallow the pill or snort it, actually your blood levels are exactly the same. So, theoretically it's a less abusable alternative, but, most people aren't going to abuse it anyway. But I think it's just sort of, it's a slow sort of culture change or mindset shift that, we want people with ADHD to be on the most effective treatment for their ADHD because we want them to stay sober. Like that's a big, big deal for them to be sober. So how do we support that?
Well, and I like that you kind of mentioned even just, my experience clinically has been most of the issues are that maybe someone drank too much or they were a social pot smoker. And I try to tell physicians like, there's just no link with that and somebody abusing stimulant medications. Like, I mean, if that's the case, there's a lot of people who just haven't told you that they smoked pot or they drink a lot that you've probably prescribed things to. Like, I mean, it's kind of an interesting, dynamic. The fact of them being honest and saying, hey, I occasionally, smoke pot. all of a sudden now that's where you're going to be an addict and you can't get the right treatment. And, you said you feel like you have to want to break things, and that kind of part, that's kind of my response sometimes, where I'm like so frustrated for people, because I appreciate the fact that they say, hey, yeah, I've done these things. Like I've had it, and many of them I find do it because it helps them with the symptoms of their ADHD sometimes. So, it's they're using it to try to feel better. So I appreciate that differentiation, just kind of and again, there's I'm sure the small population that does snort Adderall, that's there. That's not typically who I see on a daily basis clinically.
No. And those are the folks who they'll basically abuse anything they get their hands on, but that is very much the smallest subset of the population. So, I mean, when people are drinking too much and smoking too much pot, you got to ask yourself why. Like, what are they treating with that? And I mean, there's lots of things one could treat with that, but, the additional stress and, frustration and dealing with the disappointment of others and all of that stuff related to ADHD, right? Like, that's kind of a setup to want to have a drink, right? I'm not suggesting or advising it, but it's easy to see the temptation of it. So if you manage your ADHD more directly, hopefully they got less to want to self-medicate with alcohol and marijuana.
Well, and I think as we're starting to wind down from, talking about the specifics of ADHD, the couples treatment and the sex therapy dynamic, I'm wondering, maybe more so for clinicians that are working with any of these populations, is there anything that you would really want for them to focus on, or any clinical advice that you have for them to just allow them to be a bit more discerning, recognizing some of these patterns, or, providing the best support that they can for this population?
The first thing I would say is have ADHD on your radar, and not just for the people who come in and say, oh yeah, I have ADHD, but the folks who don't say, because there's a lot of adults out there with ADHD who've not been diagnosed. So keep an eye out for it and see if it explains some things, especially if somebody says, oh, my kid or my nephew or my brother or sister has ADHD. That is a dead ringer that you're going to stop and you're going to pause for a moment and think, might this person who just said that also have ADHD? Because statistically, the odds are way bigger than, general population prevalence. So I think the first thing is you got to look for it. I think the second thing is if someone does have ADHD, whether they told you or you told them, whatever, are they actively managing it? Are they taking active steps to really do something about it? You can't say, oh yeah, I have ADHD. What are you going to do? Right. You couldn't say I have bipolar. What are you going to do? Or I'm an alcoholic. What are you going to do? You could say those things, but your partner will hopefully say sayonara. But, and then I think the third part would be for the non-ADHD partner to recognize, okay, they have ADHD, but this is a couple, right? This is a couple's dynamic. They got their job, definitely, but I got my job too. And that's important because, I don't know, maybe it's just me. I'm a guy in private practice who likes to run his own show, but I don't know. I want to know that I got some influence on my fate and destiny. If I'm waiting around for my partner to change and I'm just sitting here and, hoping it happens, that's like hoping for a sunny day, So recognize that both partners have something to do. Both partners can do their part. That means sometimes managing something within yourself. And sometimes it means, frankly, having a hard conversation with your partner about what perhaps they should manage a little differently.
So, Ari, as we're kind of wrapping up, we like to kind of end with some takeaways for our audience. And so kind of go through 3 questions with everyone. And our first question is, with everything that you do, what keeps you psyched to keep doing what you do? What keeps you psyched to practice?
The short answer is I love what I do and I love who I do it with. I love doing therapy. I love writing and presenting. I love my clients. They're awesome. I love my friends in the world of ADHD, right? My fellow writers and presenters. I love hanging out with them at conferences and going to the bar afterwards. I love hearing what they have to say and schmoozing in the hallways. And it's all good. Like I said in the beginning, it's a sweet gig. So, that's what keeps me showing up and working days that are longer than my wife wishes they were sometimes.
And if you could pick one piece of content media, whether it be a book, a movie, TV show, podcast, whatever, for those in the profession, what's one thing you would recommend them checking out?
Can I cheat and give two?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Awesome. So if you want the really hardcore stuff, read Russell Barkley's stuff. He is very much a researcher. And if there isn't science behind it, he doesn't say it. But if you really, really want to understand at a deeper level what is going on with ADHD, he's the one to be looking at. I sort of see my place in the world as I take his brilliant but very sort of researchy stuff and I translate it down to what clinicians and people in the world can do now. So, but he's really the source. But the other thing I would say is, so the National ADHD organization, CHADD, so CHADD.org, has a ton of information on their website, really good stuff. They have, 100 or 200 local chapters. So if you're lucky enough to live near one of them, where they have monthly meetings, or a bunch of them are still online or offering online options. So, don't go it alone. Don't reinvent the wheel. There's lots of good people out there that you can learn from.
Awesome. And our kind of last question, if you could provide our listeners or new clinicians kind of 3 gems that you've learned in your career, what are the 3 things you would suggest?
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say is be good at what you do, right? So get the extra training, have colleagues that, can support you and you can support them. Feeling effective makes this work feel way more satisfying. So that's definitely one of them. I think the second thing I would say is be good at taking care of yourself. So getting enough sleep and exercising and having cool stuff in your life. I think that's important too, especially because, the work we do can certainly take a lot out. So you got to pour some back in. And then I think the third thing would be, I don't know, maybe refer away the people who are not a good fit, right? Be willing to say no. Because you can't be good at everything. And, for some people, if you're in a small town, you got to take everyone, right? And there's no one else they can see, but online now people can see whoever they want, sort of. So, there's no harm in referring away the people that you're not going to be effective for and that you're not going to enjoy. So, I think that takes some of the pressure off as well.
That's a great one. I think a very powerful tool that we sometimes don't utilize enough, and that's saying no.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we're glad you didn't say no today, and that you could join us. So thank you so much for taking some time on a Friday to chat with us and really let us kind of pick your brain about a lot of cool stuff. We really appreciate it.
Well, I love doing that. I mean, this is part of what I love doing, and I'm sort of a firm believer in chemistry, right? If you get the right people together, then interesting things happen. So, and kind of as an awkward, segue, if I could put one last plug in. So, every year, CHADD sponsors a conference on ADHD. And this year it's going to be, so Thursday, Friday, Saturday, beginning November 30th, it's going to be in Baltimore. Also then December 5th and 6th, there's a separate online conference. And it's a gathering of anyone who has anything to do with ADHD. So there's a bunch of therapy types like us. There are adults with ADHD, parents of kids. There's coaches, organizers, educators, advocates. It's just this awesome kind of big party with amazing speakers and cool conversations in the hallway. And it's just a great kind of gathering place. So chadd.org, and then you can go from there. But it's a great resource. I'm biased because like I'm the co-chair, but still, I think it's a great opportunity to learn a lot about ADHD and meet a bunch of really awesome people.
Great. Thank you for sharing it.
Truly, thank you. Well, and to say it one more time, we definitely want to extend a big thank you to Dr. Ari Tuckman for joining us on today's episode, talking about ADHD, couples, and sex therapy. Ari, I know you just kind of pointed people towards Chad and like the website and the upcoming event there, but is there anything else that you'd like to direct some attention towards? I know that, your book from 2019 or any other research or anything that you're doing that you'd just like people to kind of follow.
Yeah, I mean, best place for my stuff, best place is adultadhdbook.com. And I've got like chapters from my books, and I've got, links to recordings and, podcast interviews and kind of things like that. So, good resources. As you sort of mentioned, I've done a bunch of stuff for PESI. In terms of like, trainings for them. Actually, in an hour, I'm going to record a couples therapy thing for them for a couples conference doing. So that's awesome. I'm super glad to slide some ADHD into the general couples therapy conference. So, awesome. There is good stuff out there, and there's other good people, doing good work as well. So, find the people that resonate with you, who sort of, speak to your clients, so to speak. And, like I said, get better at what you do and enjoy it more.
Great.
Absolutely. And, certainly hoping our audience will take you up on that offer and check out some of those resources there. And if you're interested in hearing more and staying up to date with what's going on for Psyched to Practice, you can visit our website at www.psychedtopractice.com or follow us on all major social media. We'll be back next week, but until then, be well, stay psyched. The information contained in this podcast and on the Psyched to Practice website is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional, psychological, psychiatric, educational, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no professional patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host, guests, and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health professional or practitioner, please contact services in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please locate a supervisor with experience to fit your professional needs.